You probably won't survive this version of the West. Not because you'd be shot in a duel at noon, but because you'd keep waiting for rules that never actually arrive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always strange and oddly comforting to know where in the world people are listening from as this story unfolds. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk forward and no one stops you. Not because you're welcome, because no one is in charge enough to care. The town looks organized at a glance. There's a saloon, a general store, a jail with one cell, and a church that only fills up when someone dies. This setup feels familiar because it's been burned into popular memory. What you don't see is the invisible hierarchy humming beneath it all. Power here doesn't sit in buildings. It moves between people, carried in favors, threats, and reputation. There is a sheriff. There almost always is. A real historical fact. In many frontier towns, the sheriff was elected, not appointed. Sounds democratic. But elections in the 1800s West were less about ballots and more about who controlled the town on voting day. If you owned the biggest ranch, employed the most men, or had friends who carried rifles instead of opinions, odds were good your candidate won. Sometimes you didn't even need an election, just a quiet understanding. You nod at the sheriff as you pass. He nods back, but his hand doesn't leave his belt. Not a threat. A habit. He's not thinking about justice. He's thinking about balance. Who can he arrest without starting a feud? Who can he ignore without looking weak? The law here isn't blind. It's squinting, trying to survive until sundown. Historians still argue whether frontier lawlessness was exaggerated by later storytellers, but court records that do survive show a pattern. Crimes punished inconsistently, sentences changing based on who you were, not what you did. You step near the jail, one cell, one bed. Sometimes no bars, just a locked door and social pressure. A quirky but real tidbit. In some towns, prisoners were trusted to sit inside simply because escaping would anger the entire community. That trust evaporated quickly once the town grew or money entered the picture. Money always changes things. A man rides past on a well-fed horse. His boots are clean. His hat is new. He doesn't look at you because he doesn't have to. This is someone with leverage. Maybe a cattle baron. Maybe a railroad agent. Maybe both. He doesn't carry a badge, but he doesn't need one. His power is quieter and therefore more dangerous. You notice how conversations lower when he passes, how the sheriff suddenly becomes very interested in a loose nail on the jail wall. This is the unspoken constitution of the West. Authority flows toward wealth, land, and violence in that order, but often all at once. There's a joke people used back then, dark humor, frontier style, that the law arrived on the same wagon as the coffin maker. Turns out it wasn't really a joke. Formal courts were rare, understaffed, and far away. Judges rode circuit, meaning they traveled between towns, sometimes only appearing a few times a year. Until then, justice was flexible. You hear an argument spill out of the saloon. Two men, voices sharp, but controlled. No fists yet. Everyone is listening without looking. This is how disputes are measured, by who backs down first. Violence isn't constant, despite the movies. It's expensive. What's cheaper is the threat of it. Here's another mainstream fact that never quite makes the highlight reels. Most Western towns wanted order. Desperately. Merchants hated chaos. Families needed predictability. But order didn't mean fairness. It meant stability for those already on top. Sometimes that meant letting a killer walk because arresting him would trigger a range war. Sometimes it meant hanging a nobody quickly to prove the town still had teeth. Efficiency over ethics. Historians still argue whether lynchings in the Old West were about justice or social control. The uncomfortable answer is often both. You glance at the church. It's quiet now. On Sundays, it preaches morality. On weekdays, it stays silent. The West didn't reject morals, it outsourced them. Personal codes mattered more than written law. Break the wrong code, and no statute would save you. You realize something unsettling. You've been standing here for a while, and no one has asked your name. Identity here isn't paperwork, it's reputation. If no one knows you, you're either invisible or dangerous. Both can get you killed. There's a faint laugh behind you. Someone mutters a joke about civilization arriving next year. That joke has been told every year for decades. And as you keep walking, dust rising with each step, one truth settles in slowly, like the heat. The Wild West didn't lack justice by accident. It replaced justice with power because power worked faster. And tomorrow, it will work again. You keep moving because standing still in a place like this feels like choosing a side without realizing it. The sun is higher now, pressing warmth into your shoulders, and the town has fully woken up. Doors swing open, boots scrape. Somewhere, a piano practices the same 3 notes, like it's trying to remember a song it once knew. This is where you start noticing the faces behind the titles. The sheriff isn't alone. He never is. Around him orbit deputies, constables, town marshals. Names that sound official, until you realize most of them were appointed the same way. A man chooses a drinking buddy. Loyalty first. Competence second. Morality optional. In many towns, the badge didn't come with a salary, just permission. Permission to collect fees, favors, and sometimes gratitude that could be traded later, like poker chips. That's a mainstream fact people forget. Lawmen in the West were often unpaid or underpaid, which meant enforcement had to be creative. You watch the sheriff talk with a preacher. The conversation looks friendly, but it's really about alignment. The church gives moral cover. The badge gives muscle. Together, they create something that looks like righteousness from a distance. Up close, it's more like mutual survival. You pass a deputy leaning against the wall, spinning his revolver cylinder with casual confidence. He smiles at you. Not warmly, not cruelly. Assessing. Deputies here aren't trained professionals. They're men with reputations. Some are former cowboys. Some are former drifters. A few are former criminals who decided being legal was safer than being hunted. There's a light joke going around town that becoming a lawman is the fastest way to stop being arrested. It's funny because it's sometimes true. Historians still argue whether frontier sheriffs were primarily peacekeepers or political figures. But voting records and arrest patterns suggest something closer to local kings with limited reins. You hear a story whispered near the water trough. A man shot another man last winter. Everyone knows it. The shooter claimed self-defense. The victim had no family here. Case closed. No trial. No paperwork. Just a nod from the sheriff and a long pause before anyone spoke again. That pause, that's the real courtroom. You wander toward the edge of town where tents and half-built houses cluster, like thoughts that haven't fully formed. This is where the law thins out. The sheriff rarely comes here unless he brings help. Saints don't patrol alone. Saints. That's what people sometimes call the good lawmen. The rare ones who try. The ones who actually believe in right and wrong instead of strong and weak. They exist. They're just exhausted. A real historical example echoes here without being named. Some frontier marshals were genuinely dedicated to fairness, but their average life expectancy was short. Being honest made you predictable. Predictable got you killed. You notice how the sheriff chooses his battles. He stops a drunk from harassing a shopkeeper. Public, visible, safe. But he walks right past a well-known gunman who's wanted in 3 other territories. That man belongs to someone powerful. Touching him would ripple outward. This is the secret math of the West. Justice minus consequences equals suicide. There's a quirky tidbit you overhear, said with a grin, that some lawmen kept two sets of rules, one for daylight, one for after dark. Daytime law was for show. Night law was for survival. Everyone laughed. No one argued. You drift back toward the saloon. Inside, deals are happening that will never be written down. The bartender knows more about justice than the judge ever will. Who pays debts? Who cheats? Who lies badly? Information is currency, and bartenders are banks. You catch your reflection in the mirror behind the bar, dusty, anonymous, observant. You realize something uncomfortable. If you were accused of a crime right now, your fate would depend entirely on who speaks first on your behalf. Not evidence, not truth. Advocacy. Historians still argue whether the lack of centralized authority made the West more violent or merely more honest about power. Either way, you're watching the experiment fail quietly. A woman laughs at a table nearby, loud enough to cut through the room. She's safer than she looks because she belongs to someone important. Belonging, you're learning, is the closest thing to protection here. The sheriff steps inside. Conversation shifts, not stops, just bends around him. He orders a drink he won't pay for. No one complains. Authority comes with tabs. As you leave, the sun begins its slow descent, and you understand the unspoken rule governing saints and scoundrels alike. Justice in the Wild West isn't about what's right. It's about what you can enforce and what you can afford to ignore. You drift toward the building everyone pretends matters most, the courthouse. From the outside, it looks respectable enough. Squared beams, a raised porch, maybe even a flag if the town is feeling ambitious. Respectability is a costume here, and this building wears it well. Inside, the air is cooler, heavier. Dust settles on benches polished smooth by nervous hands. The judge's desk sits slightly elevated, not because the law demands it, but because height still means authority to the human brain. Some things never change. A mainstream fact settles in as you take a seat. Frontier courts were often temporary, understaffed, and wildly inconsistent. Judges rode circuits that could span hundreds of miles, meaning justice arrived on horseback and left just as abruptly. When the judge wasn't in town, the law went dormant, like a shop with the lights off but the door unlocked. You imagine waiting months for your case, while the man who wronged you walks free, drinks nightly at the saloon, and slowly becomes untouchable, simply because time passes. Delay here isn't neutral. It favors whoever already holds power. The judge enters. He looks tired, which is not reassuring. His robe doesn't quite fit, as if it belonged to someone else first. Sometimes it did. Judges were often appointed by distant governors or territorial officials who had never seen this town, relying on recommendations from the very men who benefit from favorable rulings. That's not corruption in the movie sense. It's administrative convenience. Historians still argue whether frontier judges were compromised or merely overwhelmed. But court transcripts reveal a pattern of rushed proceedings and sentences that varied wildly for identical crimes. The case begins. Two men stand before the bench. One is well dressed. The other smells like travel and bad luck. No one mentions this difference out loud, but everyone notices. Witnesses speak. Evidence is thin. Testimony contradicts itself. No one seems particularly bothered. You realize trials here aren't about discovering truth. They're about confirming what the town has already decided. Court is theater, and the verdict is the applause line everyone's waiting for. A quirky tidbit floats through your mind. In some Western courts, juries were assembled so hastily that jurors sometimes didn't understand the charges. One recorded juror famously asked what crime he was supposed to be judging halfway through deliberations. The verdict still stood. The judge clears his throat. The ruling comes quickly. The well-dressed man walks free. The other is fined more money than he's ever seen. He'll work it off, maybe. Or disappear. Either outcome suits the town. You step outside as the crowd disperses, and it hits you. This place doesn't lack law. It has too much of the wrong kind. Law without teeth. Law without consistency. Law without memory. Because memory is dangerous. If the court remembered every injustice, it would have to explain itself. You wander behind the courthouse where old notices are tacked to a board. Some are wanted posters. Some are summonses long expired. Paper justice, yellowing quietly. You wonder how many people were judged here whose names never made it to a ledger. There's a low joke drifting by. Someone mutters that court day is just market day with fancier words. It earns a few chuckles. Humor here isn't joy. It's pressure release. You notice something else. No appeals process. No higher authority to check the ruling. Once the judge leaves town, so does any chance of reconsideration. Finality comes fast on the frontier, even when it's wrong. Historians still argue whether the absence of appeals made frontier justice more efficient or more cruel. The answer depends entirely on which side of the bench you stood on. You think about how this system shapes behavior. If courts are unreliable, people stop using them. They settle disputes privately, with threats, with hired guns, with favors called in at inconvenient times. The courtroom becomes ceremonial, a place you go only when power aligns in your favor. That realization connects something in your mind. The law didn't fail here, it adapted. It bent toward power because power was consistent. A man with land, money, or armed friends could guarantee outcomes. The court couldn't. You pass a man counting coins on the courthouse steps. He lost his case, but he's smiling. He knew the verdict days ago. This was just paperwork catching up with reality. As the afternoon drags on, the building empties. The judge packs his things. He'll be gone by morning. The town will return to its normal operating system. Informal rule, enforced selectively, remembered conveniently. You pause and look back at the courthouse one last time. It stands solid, official, almost noble in the golden light. A symbol that suggests fairness to anyone passing through. But you know better now. Justice here doesn't live in buildings. It lives in relationships, leverage, and fear. The court is just where power goes to feel legitimate for an hour or two. And as you walk away, dust rising again with each step, you understand why the Wild West never quite trusted its own laws. They arrived late and left early. You don't have to look far to see where the real decisions are made. Follow the money. It leaves tracks deeper than wagon ruts. You pass a large building near the center of town. 2 stories, clean windows, guarded horses. Not a bank exactly. More like a nerve center. This is where ranch contracts are signed, rail schedules discussed, and favors exchanged with smiles that never quite reach the eyes. If the courthouse is theater, this place is rehearsal. A mainstream fact settles in as you listen from the porch. By the late 1800s, a small number of cattle barons, railroad executives, and land speculators controlled enormous portions of Western territory. Some owned more land than entire eastern counties. And with land came influence, over jobs, housing, food, and protection. You notice how people speak differently here. Softer, more careful. This is the sound of economic gravity. Inside, a man with ink-stained fingers talks numbers with another man whose boots have never seen mud. They're deciding the future of a town without mentioning it. Raise freight rates, and merchants fail. Change grazing access, and families vanish by winter. None of this requires violence. Violence is crude. Money is elegant. There's a quiet joke floating around town that justice costs extra out here. It's funny until you realize it's literal. You learn a quirky tidbit over coffee. In some Western territories, wealthy defendants could hire private judges, legal professionals who would advise courts or mediate disputes. Officially neutral, conveniently aligned, no law against it, no shame either. Historians still argue whether frontier capitalism accelerated order or merely replaced chaos with corporate feudalism, but the paper trail tells a consistent story. Once money arrived, it stayed in charge. You walk past the rancher again, the one with the clean boots. He nods this time. Recognition is power's way of marking territory. His ranch employs half the town. The sheriff's cousin works for him. The judge stayed in his guest house last night. None of this is secret. That's the most unsettling part. You realize something subtle but critical. Morality here isn't debated, it's priced. Fines are easier for the wealthy. Bail is meaningless to someone with land deeds. A crime that ruins one man barely inconveniences another. A worker gets fired outside the building. No shouting, just a quiet dismissal. He knows better than to argue. He also knows the law won't help him. Employment contracts are loose suggestions out here. The sheriff won't intervene. The court won't hear it. The preacher will tell him it's God's plan. You almost laugh at the efficiency. Almost. Another historical truth surfaces. Railroads were granted massive land subsidies by governments desperate to tame the West. These grants created private empires overnight. Rail companies dictated town locations, property values, and political appointments. If a town resisted, the tracks simply bypassed it. Ghost towns weren't accidents. They were business decisions. Historians still argue whether railroads civilized the West or strangled it. Standing here, you can feel the answer depends on who signed the contracts. You notice how the sheriff tips his hat when railroad agents pass. Not respect, acknowledgement. Power recognizing power. Guns don't scare money. Money hires better guns. As afternoon leans toward evening, deals conclude. Papers fold. Hands shake. Futures lock into place. No blood is spilled, but damage is done all the same. You step back into the street and feel smaller somehow. Not powerless, aware. The West didn't abandon justice because it was lawless. It abandoned justice because justice was inefficient. Power needed speed. Money provided it. And as you walk on, you understand the cruel elegance of it all. In the Wild West, morality wasn't broken. It was simply outbid. You hear the gun before you see it. Not a dramatic crack, just a flat, efficient sound, like a door slamming shut on an argument. People freeze for half a breath, then relax when they realize it's over. One shot, one decision, no debate. This is how rules are written here. You follow the sound to the edge of town, where a man is reholstering his revolver with the calm of someone returning a tool to its place. Another man is on the ground, wounded but alive, clutching his shoulder and swearing quietly. No one rushes to help. They're waiting to see what the shooter does next. His reaction will determine whether this was self-defense or trouble. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you watch. Firearms were so common in the West that many towns tried, and mostly failed, to regulate them. Some required visitors to surrender weapons upon entry. Others ignored the idea entirely. Enforcement depended on who you were and how many friends you had. The sheriff arrives late. He always does. Timing is a form of neutrality. He surveys the scene, asks a few questions he already knows the answers to, then makes a decision that feels less like judgment and more like accounting. Who matters more? Who costs more to punish? You realize something unsettling. The gun didn't end the conflict. It finalized it. There's a quirky tidbit people like to repeat, half as folklore, half as warning, that many frontier constitutions were never written down because everyone already knew them. Don't steal from the powerful. Don't kill without permission. Don't challenge a man who can afford retaliation. These rules are enforced instantly, and remembered forever. Historians still argue whether widespread gun ownership made the West safer through deterrence or deadlier through escalation. Standing here, you suspect the answer depends on whose hand was steady. The wounded man is helped to his feet. He nods at the sheriff. Gratitude or submission? You can't tell. He won't press charges. He can't afford to. The shooter walks away, reputation slightly enhanced. Violence here is a resume line. You notice how no one mentions the law. Not the statute, not the code. The revolver did the talking. It always does when words fail. You walk on, thinking about how guns quietly replaced written agreements. A contract backed by force doesn't need fine print. In the West, the most persuasive argument was always the one you could repeat without hesitation. A light joke drifts past you. Someone says the town should just engrave the rules on a bullet. A few people laugh. You do too, because not laughing feels dangerous. You remember the courthouse from earlier. The judge's careful language, the delayed decisions. Compare that to this. Instant enforcement, clear outcomes, no appeals. Brutal, yes, but efficient. Power prefers efficiency. Another fact slips into place. Many Western towns had higher rates of weapon ownership than modern standards, yet gunfights were less frequent than movies suggest. The threat mattered more than the act. Knowing violence could happen kept people compliant. Fear is cheaper than force. Historians still argue whether this balance was stable or fragile. You watch the dust settle and think it was both. Stable until it wasn't. The sheriff finally speaks. Take it outside town next time. That's the verdict. Jurisdiction ends where convenience does. As evening approaches, you feel the weight of this unwritten constitution pressing down. Guns don't create order here. They define it. They decide who speaks, who listens, and who leaves. You realize the Wild West didn't need lawmakers to write rules. It had something faster. Cold steel, steady hands, and the quiet understanding that the strongest argument is the one no one dares to challenge twice. Night falls the way it always does here, without asking permission. The heat loosens its grip, lanterns bloom like cautious stars, and the town exhales. This is when rules soften. This is when crowds remember they outnumber individuals. You feel it before you see it. A low hum. Voices overlapping, not shouting yet, but leaning that way. Sound carries differently after dark. Every footstep feels louder. Every pause feels heavier. You follow the noise to the square. A man stands near the well, hands raised just enough to suggest compliance, not enough to look weak. His hat is gone. Someone took it, which tells you everything you need to know about how this will end. Hats are respect. Losing one publicly is a verdict. A mainstream historical fact settles in quietly. Lynchings and mob punishments were far more common in the Old West than formal executions. Courts were slow. Jails were fragile. Crowds were fast. And speed, as you've learned, is power's favorite ally. The sheriff is here, but he isn't in charge. He stands slightly off to the side, arms crossed, eyes scanning faces instead of the accused. He's counting. Friends. Enemies. Who he'll need tomorrow. This isn't cowardice, it's calculation. Someone accuses the man of theft. Someone else adds violence to the story. Another voice improves it further. Truth doesn't matter much once momentum starts rolling downhill. You notice how everyone frames their words carefully. No one says, kill. They say, teach him. They say, send a message. Language here works like a glove, softening what hands are about to do. There's a quirky tidbit historians like to mention with discomfort. Some Western mobs followed rituals, votes by raised hands, timed speeches, even prayers. Justice wasn't abandoned. It was redesigned for group participation. Historians still argue whether mob justice was driven by fear of crime or fear of losing control. watching faces glow in lantern light. You suspect it was both, braided together until they were indistinguishable. A rope appears, it always does. You're not sure where it came from, and no one seems curious enough to ask. Tools like this are never far away. The man tries to speak. His voice cracks, and the crowd shifts, annoyed more than angry. His words are inconvenient. Explanations slow things down. You catch a familiar joke whispered behind you, that court is cheaper when everyone pitches in. A few people chuckle. You feel your stomach tighten. Humor here is a shield, not a release. The sheriff clears his throat. The sound cuts through the crowd just enough to remind them he exists. Outside town, he says quietly. Not a command, a suggestion. Jurisdiction, again, ends where responsibility becomes uncomfortable. They listen. The rope tightens. Not yet, but soon. The man's fate is sealed not by guilt, but by consensus. Majority rule, frontier style. Another historical truth presses in. Records show many lynched individuals were never proven guilty, and some weren't even accused of crimes until moments before punishment. The mob didn't seek answers. It sought reassurance. Historians still argue whether these acts deterred crime or normalized violence. The silence afterward suggests something darker. It normalized permission. When it's over, people drift away quickly. No celebration, no reflection, just relief. The town tells itself a story it can sleep with. You walk back through empty streets, lantern shadows stretching and shrinking with each step. The night feels calmer now, as if it got what it wanted. You understand something essential at last. Mob justice wasn't a failure of the law. It was the law, stripped of pretense, power multiplied by numbers, acting before doubt could interfere. And in the Wild West, doubt was always the first thing to die after sunset. Morning arrives with the sound of metal, not bells, steel on steel. Hammer strikes echo across town as rails are laid, measured, argued over, and fixed into the ground like permanent decisions. You feel it in your bones before you see it. Progress, they call it. The kind that doesn't ask whether you're ready. The railroad doesn't creep in. It announces itself. A mainstream historical fact settles into place as you watch men work. Railroads didn't just connect towns. They decided which towns deserved to exist. Track placement determined trade routes, population growth, and political relevance. A town with a station thrived. A town without one withered. Justice never factored into the equation. You walk alongside the line as it stretches toward the horizon, iron gleaming in the sun. Surveyors argue over maps that ignore people already living here. They speak in numbers, not names. Miles, costs, deadlines. The land beneath your feet has become a resource, not a home. You overhear a conversation between two agents in clean coats. They're discussing compensation for landowners. The tone is polite, but final. Sell or be bypassed. Either way, the tracks will move on. Consent here is decorative. There's a quirky tidbit whispered among workers, that some towns tried bribing rail officials with free land, tax exemptions, even entire buildings just to get a stop. A few succeeded. Most didn't. The railroad wasn't cruel. It was indifferent. Indifference is more efficient. Historians still argue whether railroads were the West's great civilizing force or its most destructive invader. Standing here, you see how easily it was both at once. You notice how quickly authority realigns. The sheriff now tips his hat a little lower. Merchants adjust prices preemptively. Land deeds are suddenly worth arguing over, even if no one cared yesterday. Power has a new spine, and it's made of iron. You pass a family packing their belongings. Their house sits just close enough to the planned route to be inconvenient. They weren't asked. They were informed. The law is technically on the railroad's side, thanks to federal land grants and eminent domain policies that favored expansion over inhabitants. Legal? Yes. Just? That question never made it onto the blueprint. Another fact presses in quietly. Rail companies often employed private security forces to protect construction. These men answered to payroll, not courts. When disputes arose, they were settled quickly and rarely documented. Paper trails, slow trains. Historians still argue whether violence along rail lines was exaggerated by sensational newspapers. But even stripped of drama, the pattern remains. Where tracks went, power followed, and law scrambled to keep up. You hear laughter from a group of workers. Someone jokes that the rails are straighter than the town's morals. It earns a tired chuckle. Humor, again, as insulation. By afternoon, a temporary office appears near the tracks. Decisions that once took weeks now take minutes. Complaints are redirected. Promises are vague. Authority has found something it respects. Infrastructure. You realize something chillingly simple. The railroad doesn't replace justice. It renders it irrelevant. When movement, trade, and money depend on schedules, disputes become obstacles, not moral dilemmas. As you walk back toward town, the sound of hammering follows you, steady and unstoppable. The West isn't being tamed, it's being reorganized. And you understand now why power loves rails. They don't just connect places, they erase alternatives. You don't notice them at first. That's the point. They don't ride into town with banners or badges. No uniforms, no speeches. Just men who look slightly too clean for the work they claim to do, and slightly too calm for a place that runs on nerves. They arrive quietly, rent rooms under false names, and ask very specific questions over very cheap drinks. These are the professionals. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you listen from a corner table. Private detective agencies, most famously the Pinkertons, were hired extensively throughout the late 1800s to protect railroads, hunt outlaws, break strikes, and intimidate communities. They were legal, they were armed, and they answered to whoever signed the check. You watch one of them speak with the sheriff. The conversation is brief, polite, final. The sheriff nods the way a man nods when he understands he's no longer the highest authority in the room. The badge doesn't disappear. It just gets smaller. There's a quiet joke floating through town that these men carry warrants written in ink you can't see. It gets a few laughs. No one pushes it further. You follow them at a distance as they walk down the street. Their confidence isn't loud. It's practiced. They don't need witnesses. They don't need approval. Their justice is portable. A quirky but true tidbit hums beneath the moment. Some private agents were granted near military authority during labor disputes, allowed to arrest, detain, and transport suspects across state lines with minimal oversight. When things went wrong, blame evaporated into bureaucracy. Historians still argue whether private law enforcement filled a necessary gap or deliberately undermined public justice. Watching the town rearrange itself around these men, you suspect the answer depends on who hired them. They stop at a boarding house. A man inside owes money, or loyalty, or silence. You don't know which, and neither does the town. That's the genius of it. Uncertainty keeps everyone compliant. A door closes, voices lower, minutes pass. When the men emerge, one is missing. No struggle, no noise, just absence. The cleanest outcome. You think about how the courthouse felt earlier. Slow, human, flawed. This feels different, mechanical, efficient, designed to avoid discussion. Another historical truth settles in uncomfortably. When private law replaces public law, accountability disappears. There's no jury, no appeal, no community oversight, just results. Historians still argue whether this efficiency reduced violence or simply hid it better. You overhear someone whisper that it's safer now. That order has arrived. You notice how quickly people accept this story. Fear loves certainty, even borrowed certainty. As night approaches, the agents gather their things. They won't stay long. They never do. Stability is someone else's problem. You walk the streets once more, sensing the shift. Justice didn't come back to town today. It was outsourced. By now, you've started noticing a pattern that's hard to unsee once it clicks. The line between outlaw and respectable citizen isn't drawn in the dirt. It's written on paper. Sometimes very expensive paper. You hear a name spoken near the hitching posts. Familiar. Dangerous. The kind of name children are warned about, and businessmen quietly toast to. An outlaw, officially. A criminal, legally. A problem, selectively. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you listen. Many so-called outlaws of the Wild West were former employees, enforcers, or contractors for powerful interests, railroads, ranch syndicates, mining companies, before they fell out of favor. When they were useful, they were men who got things done. When they weren't, they became bandits. You realize reputation here isn't about behavior. It's about sponsorship. You watch a well-dressed man exit the hotel with a grin, shaking hands with someone whose face appears on wanted posters in 3 territories. No tension. No irony. Just business. The outlaw tips his hat politely and heads toward the stables. Free to ride away because, for now, he belongs to the right people. There's a quirky tidbit people don't like to talk about, that some notorious gunmen were kept on unofficial payrolls, paid to discourage competition or settle disputes that polite society didn't want its fingerprints on. The difference between hired muscle and criminal was timing. Historians still argue whether outlaw culture was a rebellion against authority or a byproduct of capitalism without guardrails. Standing here, you see how comfortably criminals and employers coexist when interests align. You wander past the newspaper office. Headlines scream about lawlessness, danger, and the need for order. Inside, the editor drinks with a man whose wealth was built on the same violence the paper condemns. Moral outrage sells papers. Hypocrisy pays better. You notice how the sheriff treats different criminals differently. The small-time thief is chased relentlessly. The famous gunman is monitored. Translation: ignored until inconvenient. A light joke floats by. Someone says it's not a crime if you can afford the lawyer and the apology. It gets a few tired laughs. No one disagrees. Another historical truth settles in. Bounty systems incentivized capture, not justice. Rewards were posted unevenly, often targeting men without protection, while leaving well-connected offenders untouched. Justice followed profit margins. Historians still argue whether bounties reduced crime or institutionalized corruption. You watch a wanted poster curl in the heat and think the answer is printed right there, in who's missing from the wall. You start to understand how myths are born. Outlaws become folk heroes when they embarrass authority. Employers become pillars of society when they win. Same actions, different framing. As dusk approaches, you realize the Wild West didn't struggle to tell right from wrong. It struggled to decide who got to define them. You step beyond the town's edges now, where fences thin out and the land starts remembering older rules. The air changes, quieter, wider. This place doesn't feel empty. It feels occupied by something the town refuses to acknowledge. You notice paths that don't appear on any map. Camps arranged with intention, not haste. Fires that burn low and efficient. This isn't chaos. It's order of a different kind. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you move carefully. Before and during Western expansion, Native American nations operated complex legal systems, tribal courts, councils, restitution practices, and restorative justice models that governed everything from trade disputes to violent crime. These systems existed long before settlers arrived. They were ignored anyway. You hear a story from a trader passing through. He laughs as he tells it, which is how you know it's cruel. A native man sought justice for stolen horses. He followed his own law. When he enforced it, settlers called it theft. When they enforced theirs, they called it civilization. That's how power renames things. There's a quirky but telling tidbit historians often mention. Some U.S. officials openly admitted they didn't recognize native legal authority because doing so would slow land acquisition. Justice, once again, lost to efficiency. Historians still argue whether the dismissal of native law was driven by racism, fear, or economic hunger. Out here, the distinction feels academic. The outcome was the same. Entire systems erased with paperwork and guns. You notice how treaties are discussed in town as inconveniences, as obstacles, as temporary agreements meant to be outgrown. Treaties were law on paper, but paper doesn't stop bullets, or railroads, or hunger. You remember the courthouse benches, the saloon arguments, the mob by lantern light. Compared to that, this justice feels deliberate, patient, focused on repair, not punishment. Which might be why it terrified outsiders. A light, bitter joke circulates among settlers that native justice is too slow, too spiritual, too soft. It's said with a grin. But the truth underneath is sharper. Systems that don't revolve around dominance threaten those built entirely on it. Another historical truth presses in. When native people attempted to use settler courts to defend their rights, they were often denied standing. No voice. No recognition. Justice requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was never profitable. Historians still argue whether assimilation policies were meant to integrate or erase. Standing here, you realize justice can't survive when one side refuses to admit the other exists. You walk back toward town as night creeps in, feeling the weight of what's been deliberately forgotten. The Wild West didn't just replace justice with power. It decided whose justice counted at all. You're back in town by the time the lamps are lit. And that's when you start hearing the most honest judgments of all. Not from courts, not from sheriffs, from behind swinging doors, from half-closed kitchens, from women who've learned to speak softly because speaking loudly never worked. This is the layer of the West that never makes it into the legends. A mainstream historical fact settles in gently. Women in frontier towns often had no formal legal standing independent of fathers or husbands. Yet they managed businesses, ran boarding houses, kept books, and quietly enforced social order. When law failed publicly, women stabilized things privately. You pass a boarding house where supper is being cleared. The woman in charge knows exactly who cheated at cards last night, who beat his debts into submission, and who shouldn't be trusted with a loaded gun after whiskey. Her memory is better than any court record. Her influence is subtle but absolute. She decides who gets a room, who hears news first, who is warned. You overhear two women talking near the wash line. Their conversation is casual, almost bored, but it carries verdicts sharper than any judge's gavel. One man is not safe. Another is all noise. One more is useful, but only in daylight. These assessments spread faster than wanted posters. There's a quirky tidbit scholars like to point out. In some Western towns, women-led temperance groups had more influence over law enforcement behavior than elected officials. They couldn't vote, but they could shame. And shame travels fast. Historians still argue whether women in the West were oppressed victims or adaptive power brokers. Listening closely, you realize the answer is uncomfortable. They were both, often at the same time. You notice how the sheriff's wife speaks to him, not commanding, guiding. She doesn't tell him what to do. She tells him what will happen if he doesn't. Consequences framed as weather forecasts. A light joke drifts by. Someone says the real law lives in kitchens and bedrooms. It earns a laugh. It shouldn't. You start seeing the pattern clearly now. Public justice here is loud and clumsy. Private justice is quiet and precise. And women, barred from the formal system, mastered the informal one. Another historical truth settles in. When towns collapsed into violence or chaos, it was often women who organized aid, negotiated truces, and kept children alive while men argued over honor. Survival required practicality, not pride. Historians still argue whether this invisible influence softened the West or merely masked its brutality. Standing here, you sense it did both, reducing harm where possible, enduring it where necessary. You leave the lamplight behind, carrying an insight that feels heavier than the others. Power in the Wild West wasn't only about guns, money, or mobs. Sometimes it was about knowing the truth and choosing when to speak it. By the next morning, the town has already decided what yesterday meant. Not collectively. Conveniently, you hear it in the rustle of fresh paper, the slap of ink, the smell of cheap print drying in the sun. The newspaper office hums like a factory that produces certainty. Words are being assembled into something that will soon feel permanent. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you glance at the headline. Frontier newspapers were often the only written record of events, and many were openly partisan. Editors weren't neutral observers. They were political actors, funded by advertisers, rail interests, and local power brokers. What they printed became history by default. You read about last night's violence. The language is clean, purposeful, a necessary response, a restoration of order. Names are missing. Context is gone. The article feels complete anyway. That's the trick. You notice how easily chaos becomes narrative once it's flattened into columns. Blood turns into incident. Fear turns into community concern. Responsibility dissolves into passive voice. No one did anything. Things simply happened. There's a quirky tidbit historians love to bring up with a wince. Some Western editors wrote multiple versions of the same story in advance, choosing which one to print based on who won. Truth, like justice, waited to see who survived. Historians still argue whether newspapers in the Old West informed the public or manipulated it. Standing here, you realize the answer isn't either. It's timing. The first version wins. You watch townspeople read. They nod. They accept. The paper gives them permission to forget details that felt uncomfortable. Once printed, doubt becomes unpatriotic. A light joke passes between two men. Someone says if it's in print, it must be true. They laugh. You don't. You think back to the man by the well, the rope, the silence afterward. None of that made it into the article. Silence rarely does. Silence doesn't sell. Another historical truth presses in. Sensational crime reporting helped justify stronger policing, harsher laws, and increased private security, all of which benefited the same interests funding the papers. Fear was profitable. Stability even more so. Historians still argue whether the myth of the Wild West was born during the era or after it ended. Reading this paper, you see it being written in real time. You fold the page and walk away, understanding something quietly devastating. Justice doesn't just lose to power here. It gets edited out. Time moves on here the way it always does. Forward, but selectively. The smoke clears. The blood dries. The ground remembers longer than people do. And once enough days pass, the story changes shape. You hear it first as entertainment. Someone is telling a story on the saloon porch, voice animated, details sharpened just enough to earn a laugh. The violence from weeks ago is now a tale of courage. The fear has been replaced with grit. The victim has been reduced to a role that fits better at the end of a sentence. This is where legends begin. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you listen. Many famous Wild West stories were exaggerated, sanitized, or outright fabricated within a few years of the events themselves. Memoirs, dime novels, traveling shows, all turned messy power struggles into clean narratives of good versus evil. Complexity didn't sell. Heroes did. You notice how names shift. A mob becomes the town. A killing becomes a stand. Power recasts itself as virtue once the outcome is secure. There's a quirky tidbit scholars mention with a raised eyebrow, that some gunfighters hired writers to improve their reputations while they were still alive. Image management wasn't invented in the modern age. It just used cheaper paper. Historians still argue whether myth-making was an attempt to cope with brutality or a deliberate strategy to justify it. Watching the story grow smoother with every retelling, you suspect it was both, working together. You walk past a poster advertising a traveling show. Cowboys, outlaws, triumph, justice. The crowd will cheer tonight, unaware they're applauding a version of events that never really happened. Or maybe they know and don't care. Comfort is persuasive. You remember the courthouse, the railroad office, the lantern-lit square. None of that fits neatly into a legend, so it gets trimmed away. A light joke floats past you. Someone says history is just gossip that survived. It earns a laugh. It shouldn't. Another historical truth presses in. Once the West began closing, there was a rush to define it before anyone could question it. Museums curated. Stories froze. Power preserved itself in amber. Historians still argue whether the myth of frontier justice inspired later generations or misled them. Standing here, you realize myths don't need to be accurate. They just need to be useful. As the sun dips low, you feel the final transformation settle in. What was once fear becomes nostalgia. What was once cruelty becomes character. What was once power disguises itself as destiny. The Wild West didn't just survive without justice. It rewrote itself so it never had to answer for it. You start noticing the change before anyone announces it. Fewer gunshots, more locks, less arguing in the street, more paperwork behind closed doors. The West is aging, and like anything that ages, it pretends this was always the plan. Order arrives the way guests do when the party is already over. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you walk past newly painted buildings. By the late 1800s, formal legal institutions, permanent courts, standardized policing, federal oversight began spreading across the frontier. Not because justice suddenly mattered, but because investment demanded predictability. Capital hates uncertainty. Justice was optional. Stability was not. You see it in small details. A jail with real bars now. Posted ordinances nailed straight instead of crooked. A judge who lives in town instead of passing through like bad weather. On paper, this looks like progress. And in some ways, it is. But it feels late. You think back to the mob by lantern light. The railroad deals, the private agents, the edited headlines. All of that happened before order showed up to take notes. Justice didn't prevent the damage. It documented it afterward. There's a quirky tidbit historians like to mention. Some of the strictest laws in Western towns were passed only after the most violent conflicts had already resolved themselves. Regulation followed victory, not chaos. Law arrived to manage the winners. Historians still argue whether the closing of the frontier represented moral advancement or administrative consolidation. Standing here, you realize those aren't the same thing. You watch a former gunman sweep his storefront. Respectable now. Married. Rebranded. His past isn't denied. It's reframed. He wasn't violent. He was necessary. The law never challenges this narrative. It needs cooperation more than truth. A light joke passes nearby. Someone says it's nice to finally be civilized. You smile politely. Civilization, it turns out, is just power with better posture. You notice who benefits most from the new order. Landowners, merchants, rail interests. The same names, now written more neatly. those who were crushed earlier don't suddenly reappear because a courthouse was built. Absence doesn't reverse itself. Another historical truth presses in. Many injustices of the frontier were never addressed once stability arrived. No trials, no reparations, no acknowledgments. Silence is easier than reckoning. Historians still argue whether forgetting was intentional or inevitable. You suspect forgetting was a feature. You stand at the edge of town, watching dust settle for what feels like the last time. The West didn't become fair when order arrived. It became quiet. And quiet is often mistaken for justice. As evening approaches, the town looks almost peaceful. Children play. Shops close on schedule. The rules are written now. They always were, just not for everyone, and not when it mattered most. You realize something sobering as the light fades. The Wild West didn't transition from chaos to justice. It transitioned from visible power to institutional power. And institutions, unlike guns or mobs, don't flinch when questioned. They just cite precedent. You stand in the present now, though it takes a moment to realize it. The town has changed names. The dirt road is paved. The saloon is a museum gift shop with postcards that promise adventure instead of consequences. But the air, if you listen carefully, still carries the same old logic. Power first, justice later, if ever. You watch tourists pose beside plaques that celebrate bravery, expansion, destiny. None of the signs mention who wasn't allowed to speak, who vanished quietly, or who learned too late that rules only mattered when they were enforceable. History here has been pressure washed. What remains is tidy, comfortable, and incomplete. A mainstream historical fact settles in gently. Many modern legal, economic, and political systems in the American West were built directly atop frontier precedents: land claims, policing structures, corporate influence, and jurisdictional loopholes that never fully closed. The West didn't end. It stabilized. You notice how familiar it all feels. Influence still bends outcomes. Money still accelerates forgiveness. Violence has been replaced by litigation, but the imbalance remains. The tools changed. The math didn't. There's a quirky observation historians occasionally make, that frontier logic didn't disappear. It professionalized. Instead of guns, there are contracts. Instead of mobs, there are markets. Instead of sheriffs choosing battles, there are institutions prioritizing resources. Historians still argue whether modern justice systems evolved away from frontier power dynamics or simply refined them. Standing here, you realize refinement doesn't mean removal. You think back through everything you've walked past. The courthouse that arrived too late. The sheriff who calculated instead of judged. The railroad that erased options. The private agents who answered to money. The women who enforced truth quietly. The newspapers that edited memory. The myths that smoothed it all over. It wasn't lawlessness that defined the Wild West. It was selective enforcement. A light modern joke floats through your mind. Someone once said, "History doesn't repeat, it just changes outfits." You smile faintly. The West is wearing a very nice suit now. You take one last look around. The noise fades. The edges soften. The lessons remain, and as you turn away, you understand the final truth this place has been whispering all along. Justice was never absent here. It was just never in charge. The sounds begin to quiet now. Footsteps slow. Voices lower. The dust settles completely. You don't feel tense anymore. Just thoughtful. Maybe a little heavier, but steadier too. Stories like this aren't meant to alarm you. They're meant to keep you awake in the gentlest way. The Wild West exhales, and so do you. The lights dim. The town fades. What's left is the calm understanding that seeing clearly is its own kind of protection. You let that thought drift with you, unhurried, unchallenged, until even it dissolves into rest. This isn't the Wild West you saw in movies. This is the version they didn't want you to know. You're standing in the dust before the sun fully commits to the day. Boots sinking slightly into a street that pretends to be a road. The air smells like horse sweat, old wood, and something faintly sour. Maybe yesterday's spilled whiskey. Maybe last week's fear. A sign creaks overhead, not because of the wind, but because it's barely nailed on. Nothing here feels permanent. And that's the first lie the West ever told you, that it was about freedom, fairness, or some grand experiment in justice. It wasn't. It was about power. Raw, improvised, often borrowed power. The kind that fits neatly in a holster or quietly in a ledger book.